You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. In the next half hour, we'll see what's making the headlines with the director of the John Smith Centre at the University of Glasgow, Kezia Dugdale, and the PR consultant, Alex Deane. They'll be with us from now until just before midnight. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you now. The Telegraph reports that firms who hire illegal immigrants are to face a new government crackdown, which the paper says could be financially ruinous for them. The Channel migrants crisis also leads the story in the Metro, with the Labour confirming that it too would use the much criticised Bibby Stockholm barge to house people applying for asylum. The Mail, meanwhile, says there are plans to fly asylum seekers to Ascension Island in the South Atlantic if the government scheme to send them to Rwanda is thwarted. That's also the lead story in tomorrow's Times. The Eye reports that UK scientists are developing vaccines in secret to combat the threat of a bird flu pandemic. The Guardian has an exclusive with a report that despite widespread anger about them having second jobs, MPs have earned £10 million that way over the last year. A survey in the Mirror says 74% of people support the paper's campaign for a government crackdown on dangerous dogs. The Financial Times has analysis showing that European companies with operations in Russia have lost €100 billion, that's over £86 billion, since the war in Ukraine began. While the Star reports comments from Star Trek actor William Shatner that it's unlikely aliens have visited Earth, something many sci-fi fans strongly disagree with. And a reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. And we are joined tonight by the director of the John Smith Centre at the University of Glasgow, Kezia Dugdale, and the PR consultant, Alex Deane. Welcome to both of you. Let's kick off by having a look at the front page of the Metro and their headline, Labour will use migrant barges too. This is in reference to the Bibby Stockholm, which might see the first asylum seekers board tomorrow. We're still waiting to find out whether that will be the case. But Labour admitting in an interview that they too would use the barge should they come to power. Kezia.
Well, first of all, I'm astonished you're not leading with the story about William Shatner and aliens. But of course, the story to do with migration is going to lead much of the next general election campaign. I think we can safely say we're going to read a lot more about this issue on the front pages of our newspapers for some time to come. And actually, this is a story that comes from remarks that Stephen Kinnock, Labour's shadow immigration minister, made earlier today, where he's basically saying to the country, look, when Labour come into office and note that transition now, Labour fully expecting to be in government rather than acting solely as an opposition and talking from a very pure public policy position. They're saying when we come to office, we will inherit the same problems that exist on the government's desk at the moment. And we can't promise to fix everything instantly. So we will have to maintain some of the policies and plans that the Conservatives have in place, even if we don't like them terribly much. And he points to a huge backlog of asylum cases just now, over 170,000 cases that still need to be processed. And for as long as those cases need processed, these particular people, citizens, individuals, need to be housed somewhere, and that's why Labour are saying they will maintain the barges.
Yes, Stephen Kinnock going on to say, though, is that the reality is we've got tens of thousands of people in hotels. We need to get them out of hotels and off the barges and out of the military camps as well, which is another option. So really pointing the fact that the problem is the backlog. Alex.
Yeah, I think there are two interesting political constituencies in play. The first is coastal communities where a lot of hotels have been taken up with people waiting for their asylum claims or refugee status to be resolved. And the second is the Red Wall, where immigration polls very high in questions of policy areas people care a great deal about. And that's part of the discussion that Labour has now taken place in too. But I want to say, I think Kezia is right, that this is Labour seeking to position itself as a government in waiting. And it does go to show that reality bites. I mean, you have to give Starmer some points for remorseless message discipline. He has not criticised the government from the left on this issue of late. He will take some heat from his natural support base amongst some leading left-wing intellectuals who think that the government's policy is inhumane. But I think that the right thing to do is for Labour Party to say, in the current circumstances, they continue to use this barge when it's finally put into use. So I actually think Labour's done the smart thing here. They won't win themselves friends amongst their own far left. But as I say, I think it will play well in the coastal communities and in the Red Wall, where Labour need to improve their political standing.
Kezia, let's move on to the Daily Mail, and they're reporting that there is a plan B should the Rwanda scheme not be successful. It hasn't been thus far. Tell us what this plan B that's being discussed is.
Well, first of all, it's worth remarking that Plan A seems to be in terrible trouble. I wonder if internally the Conservative government are realising that the flights to Rwanda may never take off and that they quite urgently need a Plan B that will work. And the proposal here is to use a Session Island, which is in the South Atlantic, 4,000 miles from where we are, as an alternative destination for people who will cross the Channel. Very much part of the Prime Minister's stop the boats mantra, the message that you're going to hear time and time again over the next 12 months. This is a very clear Plan B in the event that the Rwanda deportations keep getting held up in the courts.
And Alex, what are your thoughts on this Plan B?
Yeah, that's definitely right, that this is the fallback position in case the Rwanda plan doesn't work out. But it's also clear in the story that we're discussing that 4 other African nations are in advanced talks with the UK government to see if they could take people for processing too. So it may be that there's somewhere between Rwanda and the Extension Islands. I don't just mean geographically. Maybe there's an option between those two positions that the government can settle on. But a lot of viewers will be reminded by the Australian settlement with Nauru, where they outsourced a lot of their migration, seemingly very successfully. People thought that worked, and the far few people came across on boats unlawfully to Australia as a result. And I just note in that example that whilst it was introduced by John Howard's Liberal Party and greatly criticised, the Labour Party, now in government, has continued to use Nauru. So it's a real interesting echo of the policy debate we were just talking about, the barges, and Labour's position on it here.
And Kezia, it's actually another 5 other countries being looked at as a fallback, all of those thought to be in Africa. But, I mean, why do you suppose that they'd still be looking at Africa and looking at 5 other countries if Rwanda has not been successful? What's the difference? What difference is there going to be with looking at these other countries?
Well, that's a great point. And I think the reality is that the government's desperately searching for any sort of plan that can act as a deterrent to people crossing the Channel. Of course, there are other things the government could be doing as well, which it's less willing, or it seems somehow reluctant to do, and that's to talk to our European neighbours about return programmes. I think relationships with the European Union are so poor now that there's far less willingness, for example, to have these types of conversations with France in particular about different routes to return people who've arrived illegally into the United Kingdom. So I think we'll see a little bit more talk and discussion about a Session Island. We're still going to hear about Rwanda for months to come. But once we get past Plan A and Plan B doesn't work, you can be sure that the government's going to work its way down that alphabet with alternative ways to talk about stopping the boats between now and the general election.
And Alex, despite all this talk of plans, following on from the Rwanda plan, looking at possibly 5 other places in Africa, we're still seeing record numbers of people trying to make the crossing, though, aren't we?
Yeah, for sure. And that's part of the reason the government wants to get these plans to work, so that you get the message through. There's a chilling effect as a deterrent that people go somewhere else. But there is an answer to the question that you asked, Kezia, which is, you asked, why would you look at another African nation if the Rwanda plan isn't succeeding? The answer is that whilst the government won in the High Court and went on to lose in the Court of Appeal on a split decision, it's now appealing. The reason it lost was that Rwanda, there weren't sufficient safeguards, or there weren't, in the eyes of the court, the majority of the courts, sufficient reasons to believe that Rwanda would be a safe nation. So the government is nation shopping and looking for other jurisdictions which might please the court and get past their view on that. It's a pragmatic thing to do and say, well, if you won't let us take the people to Rwanda, then how about these other countries? That's, I think, the answer to your question.
OK, it'd be interesting to know which countries we're talking about. That will be revealed in a good time, I suppose. Let's have a look at The Telegraph and this story about bosses who hire illegal migrants. They're going to now be fined up to £60,000 per employee, so making it really very prohibitive if they're found to have hired illegal immigrants. It's quite a jump, quite a leap, Kezia.
Yes, well, the first thing to say is that if you're a Conservative special advisor with responsibility for that election manifesto promise around stopping the boats, you're going to be very happy this Sunday evening, because the Metro, the Daily Mail and the Telegraph are all landing really key and core messages for the Conservatives and pleasing the Conservative base. This is a slightly different story from the one that we've discussed so far tonight. This is a tripling of the fees that people would be charged with if they are found to be using illegal workers in their business premises. It used to be that if that were the case, in the first instance, you would be charged £15,000. That will now rise to £45,000, a tripling in that first charge. And if you do so again, if you employ illegal immigrants again after that first charge, it will rise to £60,000. What the government's hoping for here is that the threat of a charge would be so significant, the idea that the ramifications of that might drive people in business completely out of business, they won't even dare contemplate hiring illegal workers again.
That does seem to be the desired effect, and with a financial penalty of that magnitude, Alex, it looks like it probably could be a success.
Yes, spot on. Some employers might well have run the risk of, £15,000 per employee is still a lot of money, but the jump to 45 will be, I think, a powerful disincentive. We've all been discussing whether policies A, B or C will act as a disincentive or deterrent to people coming to the United Kingdom unlawfully. One of the main things you can do is try and choke off the supply of unlawful work. And unlawful work in this country has many victims. It harms those who would otherwise be in employment, but are undercut because people don't pay tax when there is this kind of hidden activity. It undercuts the people doing that work because they're denied any of the workplace employment protection rights that people who are in legitimate jobs get. And it encourages people to come via people smugglers, because even if you're paying thousands to come via a people smuggler, you can think to yourself you're going to get it back through an unlawful job once you're here. So limiting these jobs, I think, is really important. I think the government's doing the right thing. And everything else has gone up rampantly during inflation. Why shouldn't these charges as well?
And Kezia, just to say that landlords in this crackdown, landlords will also face a tenfold increase in fines if they let property to migrants without checking their immigration status and their papers.
Yes, and that's a really significant increase in the fines, which suggests that this is a particular area where the government think there is a gap or a particular way that people can exploit the system by making money off of the backs of people who've arrived in this country illegally. Of course, they'll need to make sure that word of this spreads far and wide so that the people who are on the receipt of these charges are aware of the significance of them. But this could go a long way to reducing people being exploited as a consequence of illegal immigration.
OK, let's move on to this story in The Guardian, Alex, and that is that MPs have been paid £10 million from second jobs and freelance work over the past year. Does that figure surprise you?
It doesn't particularly. It's, of course, not one MP. That's an aggregated figure. But there is, of course, one example that stands out from it, which is Geoffrey Cox, a highly successful barrister who's continued practicing, who actually, I think, in some years takes the lion's share of that entire figure. So there is something to be said about individuals making a good deal of money. I suppose in the end it comes down to what you think MPs are. And for me, being a member of Parliament isn't or shouldn't be a job for life. And therefore, a farmer continues farming because he's a farmer, not a career politician. A soldier continues at least serving in the Territorial Army or the Reserve because he's a soldier, not a full-time politician for life. And equally, a lawyer keeps his hand in and ensures that his skills are honed and potentially brings some new skills to the chamber as a result of having those outside interests. So whilst it's very fashionable to say that MPs shouldn't have any kind of outside interests, which I don't think no one's going to be completely absolutist, because some MPs are also doctors, and in the public imagination that seems to be exempt from this requirement. I'm actually a great deal more sympathetic than most to MPs having these outside interests. I think it gives them a grounding in real life, whether it be, as I say, commerce, the bar, farming, the military, or whatever.
Yes, something we've had our own investigations into with the Westminster accounts by Sky News, particularly looking at the transparency, which is another angle to discuss. But for the moment, Alex and Kezia, thank you very much. We are going to take a break. Coming up, the Financial Times reports that European companies with operations in Russia suffer losses of more than £86 billion since the war began in Ukraine. Stay with us for more on that. Welcome back. You are watching the press preview. Still with me, the director of the John Smith Centre at the University of Glasgow, Kezia Dugdale, and the PR consultant, Alex Deane. So let us continue with I'll look through the papers, and we're going to have a look at the eye first of all. And this story about UK scientists preparing for a potential bird flu pandemic in humans with vaccines at an advanced stage of development. Take us into this, Kezia.
It's one of these headlines that makes you think, oh God, what now? Because it's got the potential fear of death to it. Of course, we've had a pandemic of avian bird flu in the United Kingdom for a considerable period of time now. Anybody that's been in a coastal town or area will see that. It's quite visually apparent that that's been the case. But scientists are increasingly worried about the transmission of that particular form of avian bird flu now being found in mammals. And if it can be found in mammals, then it could just as easily be in humans as well in the not too distant future, being the ultimate mammal in that regard, I guess. So a lot of early work is being done now to try and learn the lessons of the last pandemic in the context of COVID-19, looking at early possible vaccine trials, making sure that we get ahead of the curve so that if there is going to be a serious jump in the transmission from birds into humans from this particular strain of virus, I think they're calling it H5N1 for now, that we are better prepared at least than we were last time.
Alex, does this story worry you, or are you comforted that the early vaccine trials?
I actually think this is really good news. It's good news because we are ahead of this curve in the way we were so obviously behind it on coronavirus. H5N1 has killed millions of birds worldwide, but has not impacted the human population yet. So whilst that's been terrible for avian life, it's given us an opportunity to prepare for this and plan ahead. That's point one. Point two is, of course, coronavirus means we're better prepared for pandemic episodes than we plainly were previously. And the third is, as the eye reports, vaccines are an advanced stage of development here. As we know, scientists, both in the private sector and the public sector, scrambled to save lives in our country and around the world when coronavirus struck. And my goodness, they did a tremendous job, but it came after a good deal of human cost. Here, if the eye is right, and we must hope that they are, vaccines for a potential future epidemic are already in an advanced stage of development. So that's all, I think, got to be really good news.
OK, Kezia, to the FT front page and their story about European companies, their losses, companies that have operations in Russia, up to 100 billion euros. That's about 86 billion pounds.
Yes, this is a really fantastic bit of original journalism quantifying what the cost of business has been of the war in Ukraine, beyond, I guess, what we would consider to be the obvious. So what this research does is it looks at every other factor that's impacted on business beyond higher energy costs and higher commodity costs, and looked at the cost of that. And they're suggesting that that will total at £100 billion to date, with the expectations that that will rise again in the future. Interestingly, it drills down into which key sectors, which key sectors will be most hit by that. Mind you, a euro and the pound are about the same at the minute anyway, so I'm not sure there's a big difference there. But obviously oil and gas has taken a very big hit in terms of the additional costs it's had to face. That's been outweighed, though, by the huge profits that they've made off of the back of the limited oil supply going for a much greater price. The two other sectors that have been hit considerably hard by this particular issue with the war in Ukraine have been the car industry and the finance sector. They, of course, have not been able to make up with profits in quite the way that the oil and gas industry have.
OK, Alex, we're going to move on just because of time. About a minute to tell us about the victory for Andrew Malkinson.
Yeah, I think this is tremendous. It's, in my view, quite wrong that somebody who was wrongly convicted should, out of his compensation from the state for imprisoning him for 17 years, have to pay for his food and lodgings. And that is the view that's been taken by the Lord Chancellor, Alex Chalk, and his department. I think they've done the right thing. I think most people will be surprised that we ever imposed this rule to start with. Indeed.
Thank you both for taking us through the papers. Alex and Kezia, we shall see you in the 11 o'clock hour. Thank you. Let's take a look at the weather for you now.